It's now a treat for me to bring up the CEO of Molex to the podium, Martin Slark. Martin is a native of England, the CEO with a very distinguished global career on the board of the Northern Trust in Chicago. A terrific guy, and what we love most about him is he has one of the best companies in Arkansas out in Maumelle, Arkansas. Martin?
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I guess. And firstly, I'd like to thank French and all of you for giving us the opportunity to talk a little bit about Molex today. I'm going to try and cover two things, actually. I'm going to talk a little bit about Molex as a company, and then when you hear a little bit about our global presence as an organization, try and give you, from our perspective, what we see going on in the global economy and where we see what we think are some of the investment opportunities going forward. Let me start by talking about our presence here in Arkansas. And I think there's kind of an interesting story about how did a company that's founded in the Midwest, that has plants in some 25 countries around the world, how did it end up with a plant in Arkansas? Well, back in the early 80s, Molex was looking to expand outside of the Midwest. And actually, we were looking to put a plant in Texas. And then Governor Clinton came up to visit Molex. And I should tell you that the family that founded Molex are staunchly Republican. So that was an interesting visit, to put it mildly. And he came up and asked, why wouldn't we consider Arkansas? And John Crable Sr., who was our founder, who's unfortunately subsequently died, pointed out that we were a very Republican-focused company and we weren't interested in going to what he viewed as a Democratic state. Governor Clinton said, well, let's put politics aside. Tell me what it is you're looking for in terms of investment opportunities, and tell me what it is you're looking for in terms of support. And John Crable Sr. outlined that to him, and he said, would you give me 2 weeks just to go away and put together a package? And he said, absolutely. He said, you took the effort to come up here and do that. I'll give you 2 weeks. Bill Clinton flew back up 2 weeks later and gave John Crable Sr. everything he was looking for and more. And that is why the plant is here. And it's interesting enough, on the following Monday morning, John Crable Sr. announced in the Chicago Tribune that Molex was building a plant in Arkansas and pointed out the fact that we had been in Illinois for some 65 years and he'd never seen the governor of Illinois, but he'd already seen the governor of Arkansas. The following day, the governor of Illinois was in our plant as well. And of course, as you now know, he subsequently went to jail like most governors in Illinois do. So. But joking apart, if you've probably read in the bio, I've been at Molex for 37 years. I was hired in the United Kingdom straight out of engineering school. And I'm testament to the fact, I think, that if you stick around long enough, they eventually let you run the company. So that's why I'm here. No one else would hire me, so I had to stay put. But the interesting thing about Arkansas is I've had the privilege of visiting here multiple times, and we have a terrific facility here, over 1,000 employees. We're the largest producer of electronic components in the state of Arkansas. And we not only have a manufacturing plant, we also have a research facility here that's developing high-performance cable assemblies. And I will tell you, Governor Beebe has been incredibly supportive of that and has helped us develop at the University of Arkansas an electrical engineering program where we're now recruiting engineers. And I think when you listen to politicians talk, a lot of people in Washington are paranoid about the fact that manufacturing jobs are going to China. And honestly, having lived in Asia for 10 years, that's not the issue. What the US should be worried about is losing innovation and losing the innovation edge. And the ability now to where you locate your plant and where you locate your facilities, it's all about where's the talent. And to the extent that you can build the appropriate education infrastructure here and develop engineers with talented capabilities, companies are going to invest. And we found this a great place to do business, and we're really happy to be here and look forward to expanding as we go forward. Let me talk about what we do, because I'm sure most of you have never heard of Molex. And I'll tell you a quick story that sort of illustrates that, in that I was going up the stairs of our house just recently, and my daughter was in her bedroom with a group of her friends. And I heard one of her friends say to her, that T-shirt you've got on, is that the company your dad works for? I obviously probably got it for free and gave it to my daughter, being cheap. And she said, yeah, it is. And the little girl said to her, what does the company do? And I thought, this will be good. And my daughter said, I don't have a clue. But she then said, but a whole bunch of electronic stuff all over the world doesn't work without the parts they make. And that's actually a really good description of what we do as a company. And I guarantee you, how many of you have a cell phone? Okay. Every one of you has a Molex product in your pocket, because every single cell phone everywhere in the world has at least one Molex component in it. So we sell, as you can see for here, about $3.5 billion, actually this year closer to $4 billion of electronic components. And what's interesting is last year we sold 60 billion connectors to 10,000 different customers around the world. So it's a very diversified way, in fact, of playing in the electronics industry. And the good news for us is I don't know what products we'll be selling to what customers going forward, but we all know that there's going to be more and more electronics in our lives as we move forward. The market is going to continue to grow. The market for our products today is about $60 billion. It's also a very diversified market. There are about 2,000 companies that do what we do globally. And Molex is the second or third largest company in that market, up from number 10 about 20 years ago. And our policy, I think, of reinvesting back in the organization and developing technology is one of the key reasons we've been able to grow. And I think it's unusual that you would see a company that's the number 2 player that still only has an 8% market share. So actually, our goal is not to get into a whole bunch of other areas. We believe we can continue to grow in the core market that we're in. Let me talk about where we think the growth opportunity is going to be. Today, there are about 1 trillion devices that are connected to the internet. But if you actually look around the world, less than 2% of the devices around the world are connected to the internet. So just think about what happens over the next 20 years as more and more of those devices get connected to that internet infrastructure. And if you're like me, you've got children, you know how much time our children's generation use the internet to get information. There's no question that's going to continue to drive a lot of electronic growth. There's roughly about 2 billion cell phones made globally, and huge opportunity there. More and more of that internet traffic is driven by video. I don't know how many of you these days have Netflix or other accounts. If you look on a Friday night, YouTube and Netflix combined now consume about 10% of the world's internet capacity just by downloading video. And one of the challenges in our industry, frankly, is how do you download that data faster and faster to enable, people don't want to wait 20 minutes to download a movie. And so one of the challenges in our industry is to be able to transmit that data on faster and faster speeds. The other thing that's happening, with no disrespect to anybody in the room, including myself, is that we're all getting a little older. And what's happening is more and more of the baby boomers, as they age, are obviously needing more and more medical attention. And what's happening with that is that more and more electronics is being used to do that. And you've probably seen, these days you see people carry around handheld blood glucose meters. You're seeing people download their vital signs onto the internet. That's going to happen more and more. We're already seeing people, for example, network beds in hospitals so they can see whether or not the patient's moving without the nurse moving. We're already seeing lots and lots of electronics going into that diagnostic equipment. And the other market that we're seeing growing tremendously too is the amount of electronics that's in a car today. If you look at the average car in North America, the bill of materials for that comes from the electronics industry today is about 20%. Within 15 years, that number is going to grow to 30%. So if you think about 80 million vehicles around the world being produced, and think about the electronic content in those cars going up, the market opportunity gets bigger and bigger. And today, for the first time ever, the average age of cars in North America is more than 11 years old. So there's going to be tremendous pressure to replace those vehicles as the economy hopefully improves. Every company, including Molex, is very dependent upon its computer systems. And as we rely more and more on that computer infrastructure to drive our organization, companies have to refresh that equipment and put it in place. And even though today, obviously individual consumers are reluctant to spend money, most corporations have a lot of money on their balance sheet and cannot afford for their systems to go down. And the last thing I would say that will drive growth as we go forward is the growth in the emerging markets. You've probably read about the fact that labor rates in China today are going up by 15–20% a year. And one of the things that's doing is driving more and more consumers in those markets. Now, unfortunately, unlike North America, where 70% of the economy is driven by consumer spending, that number in Asia is actually only 30%. So rising wage rates in Asia doesn't drive as much growth as you think it might. But clearly, if you look out over the next 10 years, 60–70% of economic growth globally is going to be in Asia and in the developing world. One of the macro trends that I want you to point out from an electronics perspective is there are really two things that drive our industry. Number one, the concept of miniaturizing electronics. You think about all the functionality today that is packed into one of those handheld devices. It's amazing to think that new Apple iPad almost has as much computer power as the original space shuttle had. But there's an expectation that you're going to buy more and more functionality every year for less and less costs. And so the two macro trends that we see is people trying to miniaturize those electronic devices and then also have them operate at faster and faster speeds. And so what happens to us is we'll often develop a product, and I'll give you a good example. We'll develop a product for a Japanese customer for a handheld device that subsequently goes into a laptop, that subsequently goes into a cell phone, and subsequently goes into a medical device. So often a product, when it's developed for one application, gets used in multiple applications around the world. This is the split of our business by end market. And the reason I show you that is if you think about iconic companies in the electronics industry, think about the companies in the last 20 or 30 years that have disappeared. Think about Compact Computer. Think about Palm. Remember you had the original Palm Pilot? One of the advantages, I think, of being a component company is we're not reliant upon bringing out the next device. So frankly, I hate to say this, we don't care who wins in the cell phone market as long as they use one of our components. And so this is a very good way to sort of play the electronics industry in a very diversified way in all those different end markets. And it's very unusual, I think, to have a company that is based in Chicago, that was founded in the US, that now has 60% of its business in Asia. So it's kind of a low-risk way of playing the Asian electronics market as well. If you're an electronics company, or any company for that matter, there's really only three ways you can compete. If you think about it, you can compete on service, you can compete on cost, or you can compete on technology. And one of our strategies as a company has always been that we wanted to compete from a technology perspective and bring more new products to market than our competitors. You've got to be at least as good as everybody else in those two other dimensions, but you've got to be able to out-innovate them if you want to grow. So we put 5 to 6% of our sales back in R&D. We were ranked in the top 10 on NASDAQ in terms of patents issued about 3 years ago. As you can see, about 35% of our revenue comes from new products. One of the challenges in the electronics industry is technology shifts very, very fast. And so it's important for us to stay ahead. One of the things we're looking at going forward, and one of the things that our plants here in Arkansas are very focused on, is how do we move into some adjacent markets. One of the things that we are looking at is if you look at some of the new electronics that's there, people aren't just taking a basic connector. They're embedding it in a cable assembly. They're putting active devices so that you can download data at 100 megabits a second. And so a lot more of an integrated solution that creates bigger dollars of value. We're also looking at every one of those cell phones you have now has an antenna. You remember the old whip antenna that used to be on the top? The reason you don't see that anymore is plated on the back case. We have some patented technology that actually was developed here in Arkansas where we can plate metal on plastic to enable you to be able to do that. So we're very proud of the fact that some of the leading technologies we have around the world have actually come out of this state. And so it's been a great place for us to develop technology and grow our business. That plated plastic technology will now go into LED lighting. One of the ways you have to socket those LEDs is to be able to absorb the heat and reflect the light. And that's where we do that. And today, about 2% of the world lighting market is converted to LEDs. The rest of that is going to happen very, very fast as the price of those LEDs come down. An LED light bulb today, I don't know how many of you go into Dillard's and other shops like that, probably today a good quality light bulb will cost you about $25. As they start to transition LEDs from a sapphire base to a graphite base and a silicon base, that price point is going to come down to less than $1, which means that light bulb is going to be $5 or $6 and not $25. That's the tipping point at which that technology will really take off and people will start to put LED light bulbs in their house. Because if I said to all of you, you could put a light bulb up in your house today and you never have to change it again, I'd be really excited to be able to do that. But when I tell you it's going to cost you $30 a piece, you think twice about it. That's going to change rapidly as we move forward. As a company, virtually all of our growth, 90% of it has been organic. We have a very strong balance sheet as a company, and we want to focus a little bit more attention going forward on acquisitions, but not just to grow. Our acquisition strategy is about how do we expand into other technologies and other markets we've historically not been so strong in. And our most recent acquisition was a company called Affinity Medical out in California that's in the medical electronics market. And we have a very good pipeline of other opportunities that we'll add in the next couple of years. This is our track record over the last 3 years. Very good growth between 2010 and 2011. As you can see, with the economy being pretty challenging in the last 12 months, last year was a flat year for us, but frankly, we were very excited about where we see the opportunities for growth going forward. And compared to the rest of the electronics industry, where the average operating margin would be about 7%, we are highly profitable as an organization. When you look at things from an investor perspective, the other way you might want to look at a company would be from a dividend perspective. And we have a very healthy dividend, largely because with a large family ownership position, this is the only way the family that owns 20% of the company takes money out of the business. And so that dividend yield is between 3 and 4%, depending on the stock price. It obviously represents another consistent way for investors to get returns. So that's all I wanted to say about Molex as a company, but I thought, given the fact that we have employees in 40 countries around the world, and some now close to 40,000 employees around the world as well, we sort of have a unique perspective, I think, on what's happening with the global economy. And I just spent 2 weeks in Asia and a week in Europe. So let me give you, just for 2 or 3 minutes, a perspective on what we see happening in each region. I obviously was not born in Texas. And I grew up in England, and one of my heroes, frankly, is Margaret Thatcher. And I would say she coined a very good phrase to describe the European economy, and that is, the good news is it's getting worse slower. So there's no question there are a lot of structural issues in Europe. And frankly, I have always felt that I question whether the European Economic Community makes a whole lot of sense. And I give her a lot of credit because she kept England out of the euro. And the whole idea that you can have fundamentally strong and fundamentally weak economies tied to the same currency just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it's pretty apparent that if the euro were to break up, the Deutschmark would rocket, and currencies of countries like Greece, the drachma, and Italy, the lira, would just plummet. And they've got a real challenge, because for some of those southern European countries to remain competitive globally, they have to see their currency devalue, or they've got to make massive structural changes. Now, I would tell you that I think the situation in Europe has bottomed out. I think the step that the European Central Bank made to make themselves a lender of last resort has created a certain base of stability. And some of the countries in Europe, notably Germany, that have very strong technology bases, I think will remain globally competitive. One of the things I found fascinating is when I lived in Asia for 10 years, the companies that we worked with that did well were the ones that were exporting to North America and Europe. It's fascinating now that the customers of ours that are doing well in Europe are the ones that are exporting to Asia. The largest single market for BMW 5 Series cars now is China. And you know what they largely use as incentives for real estate deals? If you look at Japan, Molex has been there since 1969. Stagflation has gone on for decades in Japan. I actually think there's a unique change taking place now in that the new Prime Minister Abe, is really taking a determined effort to try and weaken the yen, which has been a fundamental challenge for the Japanese companies, and drive stimulus spending to get the economy going. What is very important is that, particularly in the electronics industry, if you look at the companies that are in Japan that we sell to, companies like Matsushita, companies like Sony, companies like Canon, they have inherently very, very strong technology. And if they can compete with a weaker yen, I think you'll see some of those companies bounce back and do a lot better as we go forward. If you look at the US, I think from our perspective, the US economy is in much better shape than you see when you read the paper every day. I absolutely agree with French's comment, having sitting on the board of Northern Trust, is the banks in North America today are in terrific shape. If you look at the strength of their balance sheets, I think the challenge they've got today is the amount of bureaucracy and regulation they're now buried in, which now, if you look in the case of some of the banks, they've added a tremendous number of people just to meet the regulatory requirement, and it's had nothing to do with actually growing the business. And I think the real challenge when I think about the US is, how do you keep Washington out of the way? And how do you make sure that companies across North America don't get buried with regulation that makes them non-competitive from a global perspective? But I would say, generally speaking, we are bullish about the US, and there's still no question that the #1 location in the world for developing leading-edge technology is Silicon Valley. And the funding and the availability of capital that goes into those markets is still tremendous. China slowed down last year, but I will tell you that is temporary on one front, because what caused the slowdown was the change of leadership. Now you have a new premier there. I think you'll see them start to re-stimulate the Chinese economy. But there are a couple of fundamental problems in China. With wage rates going up 15 to 20% a year, with very high rates of labor turnover, and very little ability to protect intellectual property, most electronics companies, including our own, are saying, where do you go to now other than China? We will continue to expand in China, but only to support the local market. We now have several countries around the world that are more cost competitive than China is when it comes to producing products. And I also think you're going to see the world start to flatten out. We were doing some comparisons yesterday in our connector plant in Arkansas. We can actually make product in Arkansas on automated equipment and sell it to the US market far cheaper than we can produce it in China and ship it back here. And we're already starting to see customers of ours that make products with a high weight to value ratio shift the production back because they're fed up with labor turnover, they're fed up with union activity, and they're fed up with losing intellectual property. And so I think the future and the sucking sound of everything going to China is going to slow down. And our incremental investments in Asia are going to countries like the Philippines, to Korea, and other countries like that, rather than going into China. So if you look globally, I would say our own perspective is, barring somebody in Washington taking some steps that completely derails the economy, I believe that the glass is half full, and there is actually some good momentum building up for growth. I mean, people, I think, felt the world was going to fall apart when we had the financial crisis. You can see across the technology markets that the momentum is building, and there could well be, provided there's no external economic shock, I think some reasonable growth. And I think 2013 will be a better year than 2012. So let me end with this slide, and that's really trying to pull together two perspectives. I obviously believe that as a global company making components for the electronics industry, that we're in a good position to hopefully benefit from that growth when it takes place. I think a lot of the economic challenges we've been through the last few years, the globe has actually weathered fairly well, gives us a good opportunity to grow from that. And many companies now have much leaner, meaner organizations and very strong balance sheets from which they can invest. And from our own perspective, I think the key thing is having the cash flow to be able to deploy it to the right opportunities. And I'd like to end with by just saying that as we continue to grow, we are very committed to Arkansas, and I look forward to the opportunity of visiting here again, and which I love to come down here. And I tell you, I think this is a great place to do business and a great place that can continue to grow, provided you continue to develop both the business infrastructure and the education system to support it. Thank you very much.